Introduction to CUI Fundamentals. Now, the purpose of this introductory short course is to provide a first step in understanding the depth and breadth of complexity of CUI requirements for authorized holders within the defense industrial base when you execute your contracts underneath the DFARS contract clause 252, 204, 7012. We're also going to talk about the fact that each of the slides contains lots of data, lots of details in relationship to the context of the point that we're trying to teach and trying to illustrate. We want you to be able to have the reference of the original citation and, as much as possible, the direct quote related to the key areas of knowledge that we want to transfer as we walk through this introduction short course. It also provides you the foundation for you to go back and reference that and look at that in the context. So as you're looking through the content and the slides, if you need to pause the video for a moment and read the rest of the slide in order to understand the greater point, please don't hesitate to do that. Use of content is authorized for individual and corporate use only and strictly limited within CMMC EPU's terms and conditions. DTC Global, copyright 2022, all rights reserved. One of the gravest threats that the United States of America is facing is the exploitation and compromise of its data across the defense industrial base. That data is shared in performance of the contract from the DFARS 7012, from the prime contractor all the way down to the lowest tier subs. And that data is being exploited from the lack of security and the lack of secure data management practices across the entire defense industrial base, and especially among our small and mid-sized businesses. So we have to do something about this, and we have to do it now. This is not compliance for compliance sake, folks. This is a grave national security threat, and you are literally the front line standing between security and compromise. Now let's take a deeper dive into the F-35 and the Chinese version. Analysts can literally look at these two aircraft and compare which parts and pieces were not stolen and duplicated by the Chinese. This is impactful to us because the F-35, for which I benefited personally in combat operations and protection of what we were doing on the ground, I can tell you that the idea of compromising this weapon system in either capabilities or internally compromised within the data and specifications is absolutely a catastrophe for the warfighting capabilities and our ability to protect freedom across the entire globe. So DoD sees this as a top priority. We have to protect the data, and in order to do that, we have to place an emphasis on both cybersecurity and compliance. And the defense industrial base being the primary target amongst frequency and the complexity of cyber attacks, we have to develop a standardized baseline for cybersecurity and controls across the entire defense industrial base. And that's the essence of what the DFARS 252, 204, 7012 clause is intended to do, along with the CMMC certification program that's being released in the spring. The idea here is that we establish this standardized baseline and that we certify the fact that baseline is implemented correctly and it's operating as intended and it's producing the desired results in order to safeguard the information that supports and enables our warfighters on the battlefield. Our mission is to protect this sensitive defense and classified information wherever it flows amongst the defense industrial base. We have to protect its confidentiality, prevent the misuse, and prevent unauthorized disclosure. But what is the information that we're protecting? There are two types of information, and that is controlled and classified information and federal contract information. And this training series is focused particularly on controlled and classified information. The important aspect is that both of these types of information are not lawfully publicly available without restrictions. Protecting this sensitive information across the defense industrial base, we're going to take a closer look at the definition for controlled and classified information. It's defined as the information the government creates or possesses, or that an entity creates or possesses for or on behalf of the government, that a law, regulation, or government-wide policy requires or permits an agency to handle in using safeguarding or dissemination controls. So the idea here is that the federal government allows access to this information or allows it to be created. In our relationship, it's through the performance of an agreement, and that agreement is between the Department of Defense and the Defense Industrial Base Company through the DFARS Contract Clause 252, 204, 7012. The most important aspect, though, is that it's created or received on or behalf of the DoD. So when we execute our contract, The controlled unclassified information certainly can be received and certainly can be created in performance of the contract. And that data could be represented in many different types of forms. Our job is to protect and safeguard that data in whatever form it is by implementing the safeguarding and dissemination controls that the U.S. government requires. So our job, our mission, is to safeguard the CUI. In order to do that, what do we need to do? We need to be able to understand what CUI is, be able to identify it, and be able to handle that CUI properly using secure and compliant data management techniques in managing the representations of that data. In order to do that, we have to understand what are the security requirements related to the protection and safeguarding of CUI, and how do we begin to understand and get our arms around implementing them correctly, ensuring that they're operating as intended, and then ensuring that they produce the desired outcome. This is the great challenge with controlled and classified information, is doing this in a way that's consistent with the agreements that we have underneath the DFARS contract clause 252, 204, 7012, and producing the products and services that the D expects us to do while maintaining the confidentiality of that data. CUI Notice 2020-1 requires us to have minimum training standards related to controlled and classified information. Now, we don't cover the depth and detail of all of those training standards, but we're going to review them in general within this introductory course. Let's take a closer look at controlled and classified information and the definition for CUI. We know that an entity will create or possess the information for or on behalf of the government, right? That's inherent to the definition of CUI. We also know that laws, regulations, and government-wide policy instill certain safeguards and certain controls related to handling the information and safeguarding the information. And we know that the information is not lawfully publicly available. If I can find it legally on the internet, and that's publicly available with no restrictions, then it cannot be CUI by definition. Within the defense industrial base, the two major types of CUI that we often handle are controlled technical information and export controlled information. Now, your organization may have multiple different types of CUI in performance of your contract, and you need to be aware of all of them. We'll explain why as we go through the responsibilities within this short course. At the end of the day, there are 24 total categories of CUI, 92 subcategories, 110 types. And the reality is that in the performance of your contract, you can actually be required to handle and create and be required to safeguard many different types of CUI depending upon the depth and breadth of the complexity of the contract. So let's look at answering the question, what is the U.S. Code of Federal Regulations 32 CFR Part 2002 in that relationship to controlled and classified information? The fact is that section of the U.S. Federal Code of Regulations provides the foundation for the CUI program. And the purpose and scope of that is to be able to provide and establish the policy for designating and handling and decontrolling information that qualifies as CUI. That aspect of it, what information qualifies as CUI, is an absolute cornerstone to the entire program. In that, the CUI program establishes the way that the executive branch and all federal agencies underneath this executive branch protect CUI and abide by the requirements. So who is the executive agent for CUI? That would be the National Archives and Records Administration in a small office underneath NARA, which is called the Information Security Oversight Office, or ISOO. They act as the CUI executive agent, and they establish the CUI registry, and they establish also the binding guidance related to CUI in the CUI blog. And you'll see that when you go to their website, which I encourage you to do and look around, you're going to see that there's a great depth and breadth of information that's targeted primarily at the agencies, and then is transferred and transmitted down to the individual and the organizations that are responsible for executing these requirements, in particular underneath the DoD Contract Clause 252, 204, 7012, and the subcontracts related. The ISOO guidance, it's important that it's binding. When the ISOO says at the federal level, the agencies will do this, then the agencies pass that down from throughout their agency, like the DoD, and then pass that down through their policies and their standards down to the individuals in the organizations that handle or receive or create CUI every day in the performance of their agreements. It's important that you know that the executive agent manages the CUI registry, manages the categories and subcategories of CUI, and implements and governs the safeguarding standards for accessing and disseminating and decontrolling and marking CUI. All of those are applied at the federal level down to the individual agencies, in our instance, particularly DoD, and those are passed down through DoD policy and agreements down to the contracts. And then when we win the contracts, we have these responsibilities both organizationally and as individuals. So the CUI registry is the place that we go to find all the authorized categories of controlled and classified information. It also provides us additional information about what the requirements are related to the particular category or subcategory or type of CUI that we may have or receive or develop in performance of our contract. So the CUI registry, if it's in there, it is CUI. If it is not in there, it is not CUI. And as we navigate the CUI registry in terms of the category, we look to the specific definitions. And then from those specific definitions, when our information qualifies as CUI, then we apply each of the safeguarding requirements that are listed below the definitions for each of the categories. And we'll dive into that a little bit as we go further. The governing of controlled and classified information is important, and the DoD takes this very seriously. And in the Defense Counterintelligence Security Agency's FAQ, they point out that there are 4 main policies that govern CUI, and they apply to our contracts and our subcontracts in performance of the DFARS 7012, and the applying of those safeguarding requirements and the guidance related to those. Of course, the executive order applies, 13556. And then the 32 CFR, we've already talked about that. Part 2002 establishes the foundation for the Controlled and Classified Information Program. When we step down from the federal level and we look at the DoD Instruction 5248, that provides the foundation for the Controlled and Classified Information requirements throughout the entire DoD. The NIST Special Publication 800-171 defines the requirements for our information technology and the network that contains CUI. When we look at this, we realize that the DCSA points out 2 important aspects that are absolutely pinnacle pieces of knowledge that you have to know in order to have the appropriate awareness of the requirements related to controlled and classified information. In that, in some cases, the DoD I-5248 actually includes more stringent requirements than any other policies. And when this occurs, the DoD Defense Industrial Base, in performance of your contracts, must follow the more stringent requirements. That's a defining and guiding document. What we have to know is, what are we required at the federal level, and then what are we required at the DoD policy level, and then how do we apply these to our environment? What is an authorized holder of CUI? Underneath 32 CFR Part 2002, authorized holder is defined as an individual, agency, organization, or group of users that is permitted to designate or handle CUI in accordance with 32 CFR Part 2002. So now we need to take a look at, how do I qualify? How do I become an authorized holder? And what things am I responsible for when I am permitted to designate or handle CUI? And what do those responsibilities entail? Underneath CUI Notice 2020-1, it requires that all DoD personnel be qualified to handle CUI to be trained to minimum training requirements. Now, this short course is an introduction to these requirements, but it doesn't cover them all. That's covered underneath the CUI Fundamentals course. So an important aspect of understanding the roles and responsibilities of an authorized holder is the fact that CUI, in order to be disseminated to a non-executive branch entity, that means an individual, an agency, or an organization, authorized holders must reasonably expect that all intended recipients are authorized to receive the CUI and have a basic understanding of how to handle it. That basic understanding is provided by the CUI Notice 2020-1 minimum training requirements, and there are a few other qualifiers that we'll touch on as well. From the Defense Counterintelligence Security Agency's FAQ, we know that anyone can create CUI. Unfortunately, though, it's been my experience, and I've done this, looked at literally thousands of documents over hundreds of hours over the past 5 years or so, and the reality is, and it is an ugly reality, is that most CUI is not properly marked. So when we talk about the speed of business, it's important that we empower the organization, because most organizations just don't have time to be able to reach back to whomever provided that information to them and delay the performance of their contract in order to wait to see what that determination is. Unfortunately, in most instances, that guidance does not come from the industry, either prime contractor or the higher tier subcontract. But once we mature the ecosystem and once people begin to have a much better understanding of what CUI is and isn't, I think that will improve certainly over the near term in the next couple of years. Now we're going to take a closer look at CUI as defined within the contract clause DFARS 252, 204, 7012. That contract clause uses a term called cover defense information, and we're going to take a closer look at that definition. But really what it's about is that it identifies all of the CUI that requires protection in performance of the contract. And as we know from our previous slide, that the DODI 5248 governs this relationship between CUI and the contract performance underneath the DFARS clause. Always remember that the DoD Procurement Toolbox Cybersecurity FAQ in the question 33 addresses this in grave detail. And again, it provides a cornerstone for the relationship between the contract clause and what controlled and classified information we are expected to protect during the performance of the contract. So now we're taking a closer look at the definition of cover defense information. And as defined, it means controlled technical information or other information as described in the CUI registry that requires safeguarding and dissemination controls pursuant to the laws, regulations, and government-wide policies. Remember that's broken down into two-part definition. One is that it's marked or otherwise identified in the contract, and that is the requirement. Task order delivery order for the performance of the contract for the contractor or subcontractor. The other side, though, is get out of jail free clause, right? Which is that it's collected, developed, received, transmitted, used, and stored by or on behalf of the contractor in support of the performance of the contract. It's important that you know that it's an either or. It's not both. So there's a lot of mythology that's been built up that, we don't really receive any CUI because it's not marked. I don't know what CUI is. The reality is that if the information qualifies as CUI, regardless of whether it's marked or otherwise identified in the first clause of covered defense information, it falls into the second part of that definition. That's the reason why we have to tease these things out so we understand what our responsibilities are, regardless of whether or not the information is properly marked. So we've, at the CMMC Industry Standards Council, which is a organization that we established including in the Jedi Knights, if you will, of the CMMC ecosystem, have spent a lot of time tearing apart this information. We wrote a paper called What is CUI? That white paper is intended to get down to the absolute technical details across all of the appropriate references and reconcile those references. It's unfortunate many of the references and citations do not properly align because they are written at different times. So we ripped those apart and we put them together in a single coherent format within our white paper. And it is 44 pages. The things that we covered in this introductory course and the things that we cover in greater detail within the CUI Fundamentals course require an even additional greater level of detail. This is a complex topic, folks. So be patient. It's going to take time to get your arms around the technical pieces of this information. Teasing apart what is CUI, and most importantly, though, focusing on the question, what information qualifies as CUI, is really important because it's very unlikely that the information that you receive will be properly marked, at least for a given period of time in the foreseeable future. So reconciling what controlled and classified information is defined in the NARA CUI registry, and then looking at cover defense information, which is the definition that we just reviewed in relationship to the DFARS contract clause, provides for two distinct things. One is that you received information that is properly marked and that says, hey, this is CUI. And now you understand how you're supposed to handle it according to the category of CUI and the responsibilities thereof. The second portion is, unfortunately, is the greatest portion of the CUI because you're likely to receive most CUI that isn't properly marked, and you're also likely to develop far more CUI than you're actually going to receive in the first place. So information that qualifies as CUI, identifying that information and properly safeguarding it is really almost everything in getting our arms around the responsibilities as an authorized holder, both as an individual and as an organization. Now, CUI, as described in DODI 5248, that's Department of Defense Instruction 5248. Remember, it's the defining policy for controlled and classified information for all DoD personnel, including those that execute and performance of their contract underneath the DFARS Clause 252, 204, 7012. It describes CUI in the broadest possible sense within this document. And remember that the DCSA tells us that when the DoD policy increases the requirements, then we have to follow those increased requirements during the performance of our contract. The policy states, pursuant to Section 252, 204, 712, so we know it applies to us as a contractor, scientific, technical, and engineering information beyond basic research shall be treated as CUI. Think about this as a bookend. This is the widest and most liberal interpretation of what CUI is according to DoD policy, and then we contrast that with the other in relationship to how CUI is defined within the DFARS contract clause word for word. When we talk about covered defense information, remember that we're contrasting between the two. What DoD policy describes controlled and classified information is within the DoD I-5248, and then how it's defined within the DFARS contract clause 252, 204, 7012. Both of those things have to be reconciled in our responsibilities, whether the CUI is marked or otherwise identified, or it is collected, developed, received, used, and stored by or on behalf of the contractor in support of the performance of the contract. Notice that the DFARS contract clause specifically covered controlled technical information. Let's look at the definition related to that in the DFARS contract clause 252, 204, 7012. As defined, it means that the technical information with the military and space application that is subject to controls on the access, use, reproduction, modification, performance, display, release, disclosure, and dissemination of information. Now remember that controlled technical information as defined would also meet requirements if it were disseminated for using distribution statements B through F in the criteria set forth in the DoD instruction 5230.24. Many of you have probably not even heard of that aspect within relationship to the definition. The challenge here is that the DoD I-5230.24 does not reconcile. It's an older document, and there are parts and pieces there that are outdated and nullified within the DoD I-5248 Controlled and Classified Information Policy Update. We take a much closer look at that in the CUI Fundamentals course. Understanding this in greater detail, the DoD I-5230.24 provides us a table, the Table 5 and Enclosure 4, and if the information falls into one of these categories that provides the reasons why we should protect our technical information, then it would qualify by definition as controlled technical information. Again, we touch on this in much greater detail within the CUI Fundamentals course. Now we're going to touch on the definitions related to technical information. You might have asked yourself, okay, technical information, that could be anything. But technical information is explicitly defined within the DFARS contract clause and another contract clause which supports it in the DFARS 7013. Technical information as defined means technical data or computer software code as those terms are defined within the DFARS 7013 contract clause. Whether or not that clause is present or not, it doesn't matter. But the 7012 clause provides us examples of what this technical information looks like. If the technical information that has a military and space application includes research and engineering data, engineering drawings, associated lists, specifications, standards, process sheets, manuals, technical reports, technical orders, catalog identification items, data sets, studies and analysis, and other related information, and that also includes computer software and executable code and source code. If it falls into that realm of those examples, and that's certainly not meant to be an entire list, but simply to provide a wide girth of examples that we can apply this definition for technical information to. Teasing this out, the reality is that this information could be produced and received everywhere within our organization, within a production environment, within the way that we do non-destructive testing and certification archiving, the way that we handle this information within our IT infrastructure. So the stakeholders related to the responsibilities of CUI really are much, much greater. In fact, there's an argument to be made that the business process and the business workflow creates and handles CUI far more than the IT infrastructure, because we do that in terms of what is digital and then what is non-digital in terms of or representations of that technical information in description of fit, form, and function, which is described in the 7013 definition of technical information. In the CUI Fundamentals course, we start diving in and expanding this relationship so we get our arms around in much greater detail what the expectation is for us to protect controlled technical information and other types of CUI within our environment. Our responsibilities as authorized holders, whether we're an individual or an organization, is to protect the CUI and comply with the federal CUI requirements, the guidance given within the CUI registry appropriate to the category of CUI, and the specific DoD policies which give us additional instructions in relationship to the CUI. And that could be anywhere within our organization. And certainly if we're sharing that CUI through external connections, perhaps to an ERP or an MRP, or our external connections to a subcontractor, or we're sharing that CUI with a subcontractor so that they can perform their functions and related to maybe an outside processor or some other function in relationship to our performance of the contract. That CUI would need to be protected and be required to meet requirements everywhere that CUI would flow. If we look at the DODI policy 5248 and we understand the fact that the CUI registry contains the different categories of CUI which apply to us as we perform our contract underneath the DFARS clause 252-204, we have additional responsibilities in the depth and breadth of how CUI is defined because of the DODI 5248's description of CUI really at its widest and most liberal interpretation down to its narrowest interpretation within the Table 5 and the Enclosure 4 of the 5230.24. Now, if this doesn't make sense, I totally get it. But I'm trying to paint the picture here that we have left and right limits of what CUI is and how that's described. And that's important for you to know because that, again, creates a foundation for us to dive into that in much greater detail within the CUI Fundamentals course. Now, diving in quickly and touching very lightly, because this is a complex and technical topic, commercial off-the-shelf products and commercial off-the-shelf items are exempt. There's a lot of mythology and a lot of misunderstanding related to that. If it is a superficial change to a commercial item, by definition, then it is exempt. Where does that definition come from? In the FARS subpart 2.101. If it's defined as a substantive change, then the substantive change itself would qualify as CUI, and that would need to be protected. So if I take a steering wheel for a tank, and I buy it from General Motors Corporation, and I modify that steering wheel for that tank, then the modifications of that steering wheel would itself be CUI. And if I included the steering wheel and the modifications on the bill of materials related to the tank, certainly that bill of materials would be controlled unclassified information as well. It's important that we know that there are exemptions, but there are exceptions to those exemptions, and we can't rightly just say, hey, oh, it's commercial off the shelf, and the DFARS contract clause doesn't apply. So again, we will touch this in much greater detail within the CUI Fundamentals course. Remember that the DoD Instruction 5248 is the defining document for DoD policy relationship to controlled unclassified information. Now, it calls out another DoD instruction, which has an important aspect to my lawful government purpose. In DoD Instruction 8582.01, it says that I'm allowed to receive CUI in performance of my contract as long as it's disseminated within the scope of my duties. So as an individual and as an organization, I have lawful government purpose as long as it's within the scope of my duties. And now I have the responsibilities, either as an individual or as an organization, to protect the CUI according to the CUI security requirements that apply to the category or to the subcategory or type of CUI that I have or that I create in my possession underneath the performance of the contract. Within your company, there are certain people that will be qualified to access CUI as an authorized holders once they meet requirements. And also, those personnel designated as authorized holders cannot be prohibited from accessing the information. For example, let's say we had export controlled information and we had a non-US person that worked for our company. They would not be allowed to access the export controlled information unless they were specifically licensed to do so underneath the Department of State and the DTC. So we always have to know the types of categories of CUI that we have and what the restrictions that apply to those categories of CUI, which may be above and beyond the Department of Defense instruction. And by accessing that CUI and the network that contains the CUI, I have to have and can't be prohibited from accessing the types of information that we have in our environment. So access means direct access, physical access, and it also includes logical access as well. Again, I can't be an authorized holder of CUI if I don't have lawful government purpose, if it's not within the scope of my duties, or there's some binding requirement which prohibits me from accessing that type of information. In order to be qualified, I have to be identified, screened, and trained and knowledgeable about my responsibilities prior to accessing the CUI. That means if the CUI is inside of our network environment, unless I've already met the qualifications to be an authorized holder, then I am not allowed to access that environment that contains CUI. But once I am qualified, then I'm allowed to access that environment, and I can be an authorized user specifically underneath the access control 3.1.1. If I haven't met those requirements, then I cannot access that IT environment that would allow me digital access, if you will, or logical access to controlled and classified information contained within that environment. Now, let's talk about the differences between CUI Basic and CUI Specified. Within the Federal CUI Registry, it provides us the list of all the officially recognized categories of controlled and classified information. And there are subcategories, and there are different types of CUI listed within there. But they have different security requirements that we have to apply to the different categories and subcategories. Understanding that the CUI Registry has two different types of categories, being the basic category or the specified category, now we begin to know and get our arms around what are the security requirements related to the types of CUI that we have within our environment. As an authorized holder, I want to take a very close look at what the responsibilities necessary to secure the CUI correctly. CUI Basic includes all those responsibilities common to all authorized holders, unless there's an exception, that I apply to all the different categories of CUI that fall underneath the CUI Basic category. If there are CUI specified categories, that's a different set of categories, and we apply different requirements to those types of CUI that fall underneath the CUI specified category. Sometimes when we have an example of an export controlled as a CUI category, some need to be protected underneath the CUI Basic, and some need to be protected underneath unique requirements called out by the ITAR or the EAR or some other type of federal law, regulation, or government-wide policy. CUI Specified, as I said, is a subset of CUI in contrast to basic CUI versus specified CUI. And again, it has very unique requirements, and we are obligated to meet those unique requirements according to the category and the type of CUI that we have. So we need to know this is this category of CUI, Controlled Technical Information, and what specified requirements do I need to apply in order to protect it correctly. If I have export controlled information, then that's a category of CUI that has both basic and specified types of requirements, and I need to apply those appropriately as an authorized holder. This is where it gets tricky and certainly does get technical. Now let's look at the physical safeguards for protecting CUI as described within the NARA guidance, DoD policy, and of course that would be reflected in our company policy as well. The Defense Counterintelligence Security Agency says, look, folks, there are 4 different major policies that apply to CUI, and in those major policies, we have the executive order that's written by the president. We have 32 CFR Part 2002, and that's applied to all CUI. We have the DoD instruction 5248, which gives us specific guidance in relationship to those requirements. And we also have to protect the CUI within our IT environment underneath the NIST Special Publication 800-171 Rev 2. That applies to every single contractor that executes underneath the DFARS 252-204-7012. As I've mentioned previously, the DoD instruction provides for more stringent requirements in relationship to other policies, and when that is the case, I have to follow, as an authorized holder, either as an organization or as an individual, the more stringent requirements. So when we talk about the definition of CUI and the description of CUI underneath the DoD instruction, that's the widest possible and most liberal interpretation. I have to follow that in relationship to the performance of my contract. Well, underneath that, it says, what are my responsibilities for protecting CUI and maintaining what's called a controlled environment? So that controlled environment is defined as any area or space that an authorized holder deems to have adequate or physical or procedural controls. And those controls are managed in order to protect the CUI from unauthorized access and unauthorized disclosure. So I cannot have an area, whether it's a facility or whether it's my IT environment, that provides for potentially unauthorized access to that CUI. The DoD instruction 5248 increases that standard. And it says that the concept of controlled environment means that there's sufficient internal security measures in place to prevent and detect unauthorized access. So if I establish a controlled environment, but I have no means of preventing or detecting unauthorized access, then I'm not meeting the DoD instruction. Remember that it's a layered cake. We start out with the federal requirements, and we apply the DoD policy requirements in relationship to our execution underneath the DFARS contract clause. Fundamentally, my responsibility as an authorized holder is to ensure that I have direct control or protection of at least one physical barrier or the means to prevent unauthorized access or observation when outside a controlled environment, or obviously within a controlled environment as well. As an authorized holder, I am responsible for following 32 CFR 2002 and NARA guidance and DoD policy in relationship to shipping CUI. This is the very specific guidance that's provided to me out of the 32 CFR. And I have to apply this guidance wherever I ship CUI, and specifically to ensure that there's accountability and tracking in relationship to the safe arrival of that controlled unclassified information to the authorized holder who's going to receive it. I can also use inter-office or inter-agency mail systems as well. That's perfectly fine to transport CUI. Again, I have to ensure that it's being sent with reasonable expectation that the persons who are going to receive it receive that CUI and know their responsibilities in relationship to how to handle it and protect it. Packages containing CUI have to be addressed to a specific recipient. That specific recipient, according to the 32 CFR 2002, has to be an authorized holder. And again, the reasonable expectation rule applies to them as well. We don't put CUI markings on the outside of the package because that tells everyone what it is, right? And we have to follow these instructions word for word in order to ensure that we maintain the confidentiality of the CUI. If we're reproducing CUI, we can do that. We can use a copier or scanner as long as it furthers a lawful government purpose. When we talk about that in terms of the NIST 800-171, that has to be an authorized device. So that device has to meet certain requirements in order to use it. We also need to be aware of the fact that when we're reproducing CUI, that device doesn't retain a copy of the CUI if it's outside of a controlled environment or if it's an unauthorized device as well. Within our responsibilities as an authorized holder, we have to ensure that we dispose of CUI properly. We can't just throw CUI in the trash, right? And that doesn't meet requirements. We have very specific guidance about the destruction of CUI, both in paper form and digital form, and on devices that contain CUI, and that starts in ISO Notice 2019-03. There's also some additional guidance that's provided by the DoD Instruction 5248. We want to follow that word for word in order to destroy CUI properly. Part of our responsibilities are also to ensure that the IT system meets requirements. Remember, the reasonable expectation rule applies to all authorized holders as individuals and as organizations. We have to ensure that the IT system within our environment meets requirements, and we have to ensure when we share CUI that we're doing it obviously in an authorized and proper way that meets requirements, and that the recipients that receive that CUI, again, are authorized and have a basic understanding of how to meet those requirements. Fundamentally, for defense contractors underneath DFARS 252, 204, 7012 contract clause, we have to implement NIST 800-171 Rev 2 in order to fully meet those requirements underneath both federal law, underneath DoD policy, and explicitly underneath the DFARS contract clause 252, 204, 7012. And that includes all of our suppliers and all of those outside organizations that receive, process, or store or transmit CUI. An important aspect in meeting those requirements with our IT systems means that we apply both the basic and the specified requirements related to the types of CUI that we have. So if we have a category of CUI that has specified requirements related to it, for example, export control has very unique requirements, then we have to ensure that we're applying those requirements, the basic requirements and the specified requirements for all the categories of CUI that we either receive or that we develop in performance of the contract. As an authorized holder, we're responsible for marking CUI according to 32 CFR, ISO guidance, and DoD policy. At the introductory level, we'll talk about these requirements very briefly. DoD policy, as I've stated many times, the DoD Instruction 5248 is the defining document for how we are to handle CUI and safeguard CUI for all DoD personnel, but those especially included within the DFARS Contract Clause 252, 204, 7012. Those responsibilities include, as authorized holders, the identification, sharing, marking, safeguarding, storing, dissemination, destruction, and records management of CUI. All of these responsibilities apply to us. And as we walk through this introductory course, and as we also take a deeper dive in this CUI Fundamentals course, we learn the depth and breadth of those details and those responsibilities. Underneath the DoD Procurement Toolbox, which I pointed out previously, it provides information about what we should do in order to identify and mark CUI in accordance with the DFARS Contract Clause. It specifically says that information that's either provided by or developed for the DoD requires safeguarding and requires dissemination controls. We have to meet those requirements underneath the DFARS Clause 252, 204, 7012. But it also provides for the fact that there are other types of CUI, which I've talked about at length during this course, that could be controlled technical information, it could be export controlled information, it could be many other categories of CUI that are relevant to the performance of the contract and not incidental to the performance of the contract. So if that's what we do, if that's what the DoD does, and we generate or receive CUI in performance of the contract, then we have these responsibilities to meet these according to the requirements. Now, the DoD marking guidance came out in September 3rd of 2020. We want to follow that marking guidance and how we properly mark it after we've identified CUI in order to ensure that we meet requirements. The Defense Counterintelligence Security Agency says in its FAQ, it answers the question, how is CUI to be marked? There are minimum marking requirements, CUI at the top and CUI at the bottom, and to ensure that the CUI has other marking requirements as well that are related to the DoD CUI marking guide, and we follow that guidance explicitly in the types of CUI that it describes within that CUI marking guide. Also, there are other things that are impacted as well within CUI media protection. Could be USB sticks, it could be drives, it could be CD-ROMs, it could be the actual laptops. Anything within our environment underneath the CUI Notice 2019-01 as a device that processes, stores, or transmits CUI would need to be properly marked according to DoD policy and, of course, according to the 32 CFR Part 2002. So how do we mark them? The SF902 and other marking labels that we can get through GSA or we can purchase commercially through CUIsupply.com provides us the ability to properly mark those devices within our environment. And just to ensure that you realize, for clarity, the DoD self-assessment methodology explicitly states that contractors must mark or otherwise identify CUI within their environments. When it's collected, developed, received, transmitted, used, and stored on or behalf of the performance of the contract, we have these obligations. And remember, that's entirely separate from whether it's marked or otherwise identified in the contract, which is, unfortunately for now, fairly rare. So the DoD Procurement Cybersecurity FAQ provides for the fact that the government does have the responsibility for marking CUI. There's no doubt about that. The prime contractor has the responsibility for marking CUI. And all of the higher tier subcontractors that may be transmitting or sharing CUI with you in performance of your contract, all of them, they do have that responsibility. The challenge, though, is at the speed of business, often it's not practical to go back to the higher organization and ask for guidance. And different to that, the DFARS contract clause and the 32 CFR and DoD policy allocates for the fact that the individual and organizational responsibility as an authorized holder is to ensure that the CUI is properly marked, even if it lacks a marking. So we need to ensure that we understand these requirements, right? We can reach up to the higher organization to ask for guidance, but in fact, the reality is we already own the responsibility as an authorized holder, both at the individual level and at the organizational level as well. And the reason principally for that is the fact that we're likely to create far more CUI than we receive in performance of our contract. Remember that guidance provided on how to properly market is within the DoD CUI marking guide, and there's another course that provides an in-depth detail of those requirements that you can take after the CUI Fundamentals course. But designating CUI is our responsibility as an authorized holder underneath the 32 CFR, because the lack of a CUI marking does not exempt the authorized holder from the responsibilities for handling the CUI appropriately. Designating CUI is an inherent responsibility in relationship to an individual authorized holder and an organizational authorized holder. And we have to follow the guidance within the CUI registry, within the DoD policy, that tells us what to do in accordance with those requirements. And of course, they do. So we have to ensure that we properly mark it, and we have to ensure that we make recipients aware of that information status prior to sharing it in order to ensure that CUI is properly safeguarded as an authorized holder. The definition relationship to the DFARS contract clause allows for this when we develop CUI. And the DoD Instruction 5248 says that it is our responsibility as an authorized holder at the time of creation to determine which category of CUI that the CUI falls into. And it's our responsibility for marking it appropriately and following the dissemination instructions that are unique to that category or type of CUI. So we need to know what type of CUI that it is, and identify it and mark it properly, and then follow those basic or specified requirements. Prior to disseminating CUI, we must label it and follow the marking guidance that it's provided for within the DoD instruction manual. And the reason for that is because that came after the CUI executive agent marking guidance. So we always follow the DoD marking guide in relationship to how we handle and mark CUI. Now, if it's not explicitly stated in that marking guidance, then we can go back and follow the CUI guidance for alternate marking methods and so on and so forth. But we always principally follow the DoD marking guide first. Lastly, we talk about incident reporting procedures, and those are our responsibility to understand and know those as they're described within the DFARS contract clause 252, 204, 7012. Cyber incident reporting is a requirement, and we're not going to touch on these details too much because we dive into them within the CUI Fundamentals course. But within those responsibilities, we have to rapidly report within 72 hours whether or not that there's been an evidence of a compromise once we discover it. Not once we define it and we wait 2 or 3 weeks. Once we've identified the fact that CUI is potentially compromised or our IT network is potentially compromised, we are underneath the obligation to begin the reporting process within 72 hours. We may not have all the specifics related to the incident, but begin that process. We begin notification to the prime contractor, to the higher tier subcontractors, and directly report that to the DoD through the proper reporting channels. That responsibility is identified specifically within the DFARS contract clause, and it provides us the guidance to do so. In order to do that, in order to report it underneath DIBNet, we have to have a medium assurance certificate. Now, you may have never heard of that before, but a medium assurance certificate is absolutely a requirement underneath the DFARS contract clause. It is a specified requirement underneath the DFARS contract clause. It's not hard to do, but we have to have a medium assurance certificate and walk through that process. Malicious software and our responsibilities related to media preservation and protection are also responsibilities underneath the cyber incident reporting requirements as well. So there's additional training that we are responsible for beyond CUI Notice 2020-1. The reason for that is because there are things that the federal requirements, that the DoD policy requirements expect us to be able to do and execute within our responsibilities underneath the DFARS contract clause 252, 204, 7012, and also the upcoming CMMC publications. During this course, we've touched on the introduction to the minimum training requirements, and those requirements are fully explained within the CUI Fundamentals course, which should be the next course that you take. At minimum, though, we always have to remember that we're applying these particular requirements and security controls within our company environment. We need to also be trained on our policies and procedures related to the contract performance within our specific company environment. So that's an additional level of training that authorized holders need to take and need to be developed in relationship to the performance of our contract for a particular company. We also need to ensure that we go through specified training related to the categories of CUI that we have. For example, export control requires an annual training. We also have requirements under NIST 800-171 to be trained within the insider threat and cybersecurity awareness realms. That training is important and absolutely a prerequisite for our accessing a CUI environment within our IT network. So with that, we conclude this introduction to CUI Fundamentals. The next course that you need to take is the CUI Fundamentals course, because that will go into much greater detail, this information and far more in relationship to understanding your requirements and meeting the minimum training requirements for underneath the CUI Notice 2020-1. Thank you, and don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have any questions. Have a great day.